What binds a fairy tale king, a haunted empress, and a dreamer monarch who drifted into silence? Anxiety. Welcome to The Anxious Historian, where we trace the tremors beneath the throne. If you believe history should feel human, tap like. Subscribe for more stories that unravel behind royal portraits. Let us know in the comments. Which breakdown hit you hardest? Light a candle, crack open the archives, and listen closely to the quiet collapse behind the crown. Moonlight spills over the turrets of Neuschwanstein Castle as King Ludwig II of Bavaria drifts in a gilded boat across an artificial grotto lake inside his palace. Dressed in a flowing cape, lost in Wagnerian fantasy, Ludwig embodies the image of the mad king of legend. Yet, behind his theatrical escapism lay a psyche fraught with anxiety, loneliness, and the weight of unmet expectations. Ludwig's socio-political context was challenging. He became king at 18, shy, idealistic, and ill-suited for the practical burdens of rule. Bavaria in the 1860s was caught between rising Prussia and the old order, a stressor that Ludwig met by retreating from reality. The young king quickly found that public life nauseated him. He suffered what we'd now call social anxiety, or even avoidant personality traits. He disliked large public functions and avoided formal social events whenever possible, preferring a life of seclusion, writes one historian. His mother, Queen Marie, foresaw this, noting her son was an introverted and creative soul, likely to struggle with statecraft. Indeed, Ludwig felt most alive not in government meetings, which gave him headaches and palpitations, per diary entries, but in the realm of art and imagination. Early on, Ludwig developed coping mechanisms that were essentially anxiety outlets, grand architectural projects, and elaborate artistic performances. He poured himself into building fairy tale castles, private worlds where he controlled every detail, safe from scrutiny. When anxious or upset, he would embark on midnight sleigh rides through the Alps, racing through the dark as if to outrace his worries. These nocturnal escapades became legendary. Villagers would recall awakening to the sound of sleigh bells and seeing the king's sleigh streak by, Ludwig cloaked in furs, face set in dreamy determination. It was during these rides he claimed to feel truly free. There's a potent emotional motif here, the anxious king fleeing into the night, trying to find peace under the stars that eluded him in the throne room. One could describe the feel of the cold night air on his face and the jangle of reins in his hands calming his heartbeat, a stark contrast to the stifling anxiety he felt amid ministers in daylight. Ludwig's anxiety often verged into what contemporaries labelled eccentric or bizarre behaviour. As pressures mounted, especially after Bavaria's forcible incorporation into the German Empire in 1871, which marginalised Ludwig, he further withdrew. For days he wouldn't get out of bed until dusk. He cancelled public appointments last minute, unable to face them. Ministers grew frustrated with his erratic schedule and non-cooperation in affairs of state. Paranoia set in as well. Ludwig began suspecting people of conspiring to limit his creative pursuits. Modern observers have debated if he had a true mental illness, like schizophrenia or schizotypal personality, or if he was simply an extreme introvert with possible high-functioning autism or schizoid traits. Whatever the label, anxiety was a running thread. His pathological shyness was noted by all. He struggled to speak more than a few sentences to strangers and hated being touched. He once wrote, "I must remain an eternal enigma to myself and others," conveying the anguish of not being understood, a very anxiety-laden sentiment. In the mythos, Ludwig II is Mad King Ludwig, a fairy tale lunatic who built castles in the air. Reality is kinder. He was likely a sensitive, creative soul, unable to cope with the burdens of kingship and modern politics, an artistic personality with crippling social anxiety and possible neurodivergence. His people, interestingly, loved him in their own way. Bavarian folk tales call him Unser Kini, our beloved king, remembering how he'd chat kindly with farmers and reward peasants generously during his secret wanderings. That part of Ludwig, the gentle, anxious man who preferred simple folk to courtiers, is often lost in the caricature. In a narrative retelling, One might highlight a quiet moment such as Ludwig sitting by a hearth in a village hut during one of his incognito night tours, the peasant family not realizing who their soft-spoken guest is. Ludwig listens to them talk freely, something courtiers never did around him, and feels a rare contentment. When he leaves, he gifts them a gold coin. As he steps out into the cold pre-dawn mist, he sighs, a mix of envy and relief at witnessing ordinary life from which his rank forever excludes him. This feeling of profound loneliness and anxiety about connecting with others permeated Ludwig's life. Modern psychologists might see signs of avoidant personality disorder in his extreme withdrawal, or even schizotypal personality given his magical thinking and odd behaviours. Yet Ludwig's legacy of castles and patronage of Wagner also shows a positive channeling of his anxiety into creativity. It's a reminder that great art can spring from anxious minds seeking solace. His story invites empathy. The young introvert thrust into power, who built literal castles to protect his inner child. In understanding Ludwig's anxieties, his terror of crowds, his dread of war, his longing for an idealized past, we dispel some of the mad king myth and see a man who might today be seen as a troubled youth, overwhelmed by responsibilities, retreating into a fantasy as a coping strategy. He is a case where the line between clinical mental illness and extreme anxiety or eccentricity blurs, and where myth, the mad king who let his kingdom fall apart, is challenged by reality. The highly gifted, certainly eccentric but not necessarily insane young man, as one scientific review posits. Ludwig II's life and anxious soul ultimately ended in tragedy, but the poignancy of his illuminated nights and haunted days continues to capture our imagination, a testament to how strongly an anxious leader's narrative can resonate when told with compassion and context. By candlelight in a gilded Lisbon chapel, Queen Maria I of Portugal knelt in prayer night after night, tears streaming as she begged God to spare her loved ones. Dubbed Maria the Pious at first and later cruelly remembered as Maria the Mad, this queen's life was defined by profound anxiety and grief. Her upbringing instilled deep religious fervour. A strict Jesuit education in a court still shadowed by the Inquisition taught young Maria to fear sin and divine wrath. Initially, she was a capable ruler and devout soul, but a series of devastating personal losses in the 1780s shattered her mental stability. Modern psychiatry strongly suspects Maria suffered a form of bipolar disorder with psychotic features, but contemporaries simply saw a sovereign who had lost her wits from sorrow. Indeed, the cascade of tragedies that befell Maria I would test anyone's sanity. In 1786, her beloved husband and co-ruler died. In 1788, her eldest son and heir died of smallpox, and shortly after, the Queen's trusted confessor, her spiritual rock, also passed away. This triple blow plunged Maria into what we would now call a major depressive episode with psychotic and anxious dimensions. Maria's daily life soon turned into a waking nightmare of anxiety. Courtiers recorded that in 1786, shortly after her husband's death, the Queen had to be carried back to her apartments in a state of delirium, the first public sign of her break with reality. Thereafter, she was beset by panic attacks, insomnia, and hysterical outbursts. She would wail and scream through the night, so much so that years later, when the royal court fled to Brazil to escape Napoleon, locals in Rio de Janeiro spoke in hushed tones of hearing the agonized cries of the mad queen echoing from the palace windows. In one report, visitors to her residence at Queluz complained of terrible screams that would echo throughout the palace, as Maria lay in bed, tormented by unseen fears. The sensory imagery here is stark and cinematic. The marble halls of Queluz at midnight, lit by a single flickering lantern, and from the Queen's chamber, a blood-curdling cry rings out. A cry of pure despair that chills even the guards on duty. This was not simply sadness. It was anxiety in its most raw and uncontrollable form. A royal mind overwhelmed by dread of damnation and the ghosts of her family. Religious terror defined much of Maria I's anxiety. She became obsessively convinced that she was damned to hell. The Queen, who had once been celebrated for her piety, now saw only an angry God and eternal fire awaiting her. During her fits, she ranted about devils and punishment, crying that she was positive she was damned. Contemporary treatments only amplified her horror. The devout Maria was subjected to exorcisms and archaic cures, bloodletting, ice baths, blistering of the skin, which she endured with terrified shrieks. Modern readers might recognize these as misguided attempts at treating what was likely severe generalized anxiety disorder, mixed with psychosis. Her British doctor, Francis Willis, who had treated George III, forcibly restrained her in straitjackets and applied painful therapies, which, unsurprisingly, did nothing but heighten her panic. One can imagine the Queen's sensory experience, the bite of tight canvas straps on her arms, the shocking plunge into ice water, her heart pounding wildly as she gasps for breath, and all the while her mind is screaming with visions of hellfire. Little wonder that one observer noted Dr. Willis's regime made bloodletting look like nothing more than taking an aspirin by comparison. Despite moments of lucidity, Maria's condition deteriorated into a chronic, anxious insanity. By 1792, she was officially declared incapacitated due to mental illness, and her son João took over governance. Modern diagnostic reviews, like a 2021 psychiatric analysis, strongly indicate she suffered recurrent manic and depressive episodes consistent with bipolar disorder, possibly exacerbated by a genetic predisposition. Her family had a history of late-life insanity. During manic phases, she may have experienced racing thoughts and grandiose spiritual visions. During depressive ones, catatonic withdrawal and obsessive guilt. Notably, anxiety is frequently mentioned by medical historians alongside her depression. One biography notes, intermittent depression, manic episodes, and anxiety plagued the Queen. From a DSM-5 perspective, she likely met criteria for bipolar I disorder with psychotic features, and her intense religious fixation could be seen as a form of paranoia or OCD-like obsession under stress. Yet in narrative terms, Maria the Wise Tale is also one of compassion. This was a queen who began her reign as a popular, competent ruler. She earned the epithet the Pious for funding charities and religious institutions. The myth versus reality divergence is sharp. Brazilians remembered her as a raving mad queen, locked away in an asylum-like palace. But the reality includes a grieving widow and mother, whose mind simply broke under cumulative tragedy. Primary accounts evoke pity. One Portuguese minister wrote that the Queen's reason went to pieces after 1788, and that she spends her days either in apathy or in inexpressible anguish. We have Maria's own few words from an early lucid moment. "What have I done to be so forsaken? My God, have mercy." A direct, plaintive quote revealing her profound existential anxiety, believing God had abandoned her. In 1807, as French troops neared Lisbon, the royal family evacuated to Brazil, and even during the chaotic carriage ride to the ship, Maria was heard screaming throughout the trip, fearing she would be tortured or robbed by her own servants. The image of the once majestic queen, incoherent with terror as her entourage carries her to safety, encapsulates the tragedy of anxiety unmanaged. Maria spent her final years in Brazil in a genteel imprisonment of sorts, 8 years confined to a convent-turned palace in Rio, always in a state of incapacitation. Locals would see her at a window, a ghostly figure in black, muttering prayers or suddenly laughing or sobbing without cause. When she died in 1816, one courtier wrote that it was release for her soul and for Portugal. Today, historians emphasize that Maria's achievements, like educational reforms and economic growth early in her reign, are largely forgotten, overshadowed by her mental collapse. Reframing her story through an anxiety-focused narrative gives it new depth. She becomes not just Maria the Mad, but Maria the Broken-Hearted, a devout queen whose life of duty and loss pushed her mind beyond its limits. Her story elicits a visceral empathy. The quiet sound of rosary beads clicking in a trembling hand, the sudden midnight shriek echoing off palace walls, the tragic figure of a monarch who carried the weight of her world until it crushed her under its dark shadow of dread. On a summer day in 1789, King George III stood at a palace window, babbling incessantly to no one in particular. his words tumbling out in a manic torrent. He spoke until foam gathered at the corners of his mouth and his voice grew hoarse. Yet, the moment he could recover his breath, he began again, while the foam ran out of his mouth, recounted his alarmed wife, Queen Charlotte. This jarring image of the so-called Mad King hints at the intense inner turmoil that plagued George III, especially in his later years. While popularly remembered for his madness and for losing the American colonies, George's life was deeply marked by episodes of anxiety, which modern analysis suggests were part of recurrent bouts of acute mental illness, likely bipolar disorder or porphyria-induced psychosis. In particular, the king's anxiety affected his daily routine and statecraft profoundly. He oscillated between periods of diligent, conscientious rule and bouts of debilitating panic, confusion, and frenetic energy. Upbringing and context set the stage. George came to the throne in 1760, a young man of earnest character, deeply aware of his royal duty and terrified of failing it. He was a doting father and a stickler for propriety, suggesting a stable personality. But the immense pressures of kingship during global conflict, the American Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, wore at him. After Britain's defeat in the American War of Independence, 1776 to 83, observers noted the king's health deteriorating. Political stress and guilt, he was unfairly blamed as a tyrant by the Americans, likely fueled his mental decline. By late 1788, George III experienced a famous breakdown. He became wildly talkative, paranoid, and erratic, symptoms consistent with a manic episode. Yet embedded in those symptoms was enormous anxiety. He fixated on moral issues, spoke of religious fears, and had episodes of rage alternating with weeping. One royal physician described the king's mind as an entire alienation, wholly unmoored. George himself, during lucid moments, expressed terror at what was happening to him, apologising to Parliament later for his illness. We can imagine him, a normally reserved and pious man, feeling the creeping dread as he sensed his thoughts speeding beyond control, much like a modern patient might feel the onset of a panic attack or psychotic break and be aware enough to be afraid. During his worst periods, George III's behaviour became a case study in 18th century anxiety and madness. He suffered insomnia and would pace restlessly. It's recorded that on some nights, the king spoke for hours without pause, over 50,000 words at a stretch, an unstoppable verbal compulsion likely driven by anxious energy. His letters from these times, analysed by modern computer linguistics, show extreme shifts, unusually long sentences, rapid topic changes, a flood of vocabulary, all indicators of manic, disordered thinking. Those letters, when read aloud, practically vibrate with nervous tension. One can hear the quill scratching frenetically across paper as the king's hand tries to keep up with his racing thoughts. At moments, anxiety bled into delusion. Famously, George had one episode where he believed he had conversed with angels, or that he was in direct communion with God. He would also suddenly fixate anxiously on trivial matters. One anecdote has him obsessively shaking hands with every single person he met at court, over and over, as if compelled by an anxious ritual to reassure himself of their loyalty, a scene that evokes both absurdity and pathos. Modern DSM-5 might interpret some of this as obsessive-compulsive tendencies manifested during mania. Queen Charlotte's accounts provide heartbreaking sensory details of George's panic. She wrote to a confidant describing how the king would talk himself into exhaustion and then erupt in shrieks or howls. During one particularly violent fit, attendants had to restrain him in a straitjacket. This large, powerful man reduced to thrashing and crying like a terrified child. The sound of the king's anguish was so disturbing that courtiers reportedly fled earshot. After such episodes, George often fell into deep depression, an emptiness where anxiety took the form of paranoia. He grew convinced people were plotting to lock him away, which in fact they eventually did, establishing the regency under his son in 1811. In lucid intervals, the king exhibited classic health anxiety too. He fretted about the treatments inflicted on him, the blistering purges and emetics that 18th century doctors used. Some historians now think those very treatments, like arsenic-containing medicine, may have worsened a possible neurological illness, porphyria, causing or aggravating his mental symptoms. Despite all this, George III was not a madman from birth, or a caricature of insanity. He was a diligent ruler, with periods of genuine clarity and anxiety about his duty. He famously said, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain," reflecting his earnest desire to be a good king. When sanity returned after his first breakdown in 1789, George was haunted by the fear of relapse. He would later tell an aide he dreaded the horror of that malady's return. This meta-anxiety, anxiety about his mental health, is something many sufferers of panic disorders or depression can relate to. He threw himself into calm hobbies like farming and famously catalogued his large library, tasks that likely soothed his nerves through routine. For storytelling, one can highlight an emotional motif here: the image of King George in his Windsor garden at dawn, gently pruning a yew hedge with trembling hands, seeking solace in the steadiness of nature while staving off the dread creeping at the edges of his mind. Modern diagnoses have largely vindicated George III as a man with an illness, not a monarch who went mad by divine punishment or vice. Whether it was acute intermittent porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause anxiety, hallucinations, and the blue urine noted in George's case, or a psychiatric mood disorder, we know his brain chemistry was likely the root cause. But in humanizing him, the anxiety component is key. At his most coherent, George himself described his condition in letters with remarkable insight, saying it felt like a haze clouding my reason, which I labor to dispel. That phrase could easily come from a modern anxiety sufferer describing brain fog and panic. Myth versus reality. The myth is Mad King George, the tyrant who lost America. The reality is a man who, in lucid moments, was gentle, cultured. He founded the Royal Academy of Arts and was an avid science patron, and painfully aware of his vulnerabilities. It's emotionally resonant to consider that this king, often depicted in film and theatre ranting nonsense, also had moments where he quietly told his son or doctor, "I am afraid. Help me." The tragedy of George III is not just that he went insane, but that he knew enough to fear his insanity returning, making every twilight of the day an anxious countdown to what night might bring in his troubled mind.